Back to the Leadership Lab. I'm Evan McGugan, former naval officer with over a decade of leadership experience in special operations. I went to the Naval Academy. I hold an MBA and a master's in psychology of leadership from Penn State. And now I advise executives, elite coaches, athletes, working professionals, and tradesmen in leadership development. Now, today's episode is about a fundamental idea that I think will challenge what people are often told. And that is leadership isn't a trait and it's not just a position. It's an evolved function that's at the backbone of human social processes. And if that confuses you or perhaps makes you a little uncomfortable, I think that's a good thing. So let's talk about why the very way we commonly define leadership might be built on some faulty assumptions and how a deeper evolutionary lens can reframe what leadership actually is and why it exists. Now, before we can talk about any aspirations of leading better, we have to challenge and continue to refine how we define leadership in the first place. So, one problem is the tendency for people to think of leaders as a certain type of person. But the research tells a different story, and it's one that doesn't start with titles, but starts with more evolved roles. So, one common assumption I often come across is that leaders are a type of person. We say things and hear things like, he's a natural leader or she was born to lead. And that's not how leadership actually works. So, according to a leadership scholar, David Petrozewski's 2020 evolutionary task analysis in the Leadership Quarterly here, leadership and followerships aren't types of people. They are better thought of as distinct and complementary roles that our brains have evolved to play. And so this is the first controversial shift that I'm going to offer. Personality plays a clear role in leadership emergence and a clear role in leadership potential, but leadership is not a personality type. It's an evolved information processing role. And so just like your mind can switch between the roles of leader and speaker, or listener and speaker in a conversation, it can also switch between leader and follower depending on the problem that you're solving. And that means that the same person can be a leader in one group and then a follower in another, or the same person can be a leader in one scenario but a follower in an entirely different scenario, sometimes regardless of their formal position of authority. And that's not necessarily because they've changed who they are, but because the task has changed. Now, here's the second twist. Leadership doesn't just help organize a group. It helps create the group in the first place. And in other words, leaders don't just manage existing teams. They propose new enterprises altogether. They propose new goals and they propose new ways to coordinate group effort. Another way to characterize them is as a coalition entrepreneur. They create structure and new orientation in an endeavor where none existed beforehand. If leadership isn't a personality trait, well, then what is it? To answer that, we have to step back and ask what kinds of problems did humans actually need the function of leadership to solve? But in order to do that, we need to stop looking at leadership as just an abstract concept and start looking at it as a solution forged by evolution. And to understand this, Petrozewski flips the typical research script in his article. If you look at the scholarly literature or the contemporary writings on leadership, most of it is going to use what's called a phenomenon first approach. Thought leaders and scholars start by observing leaders in the wild, asking what traits they have, observing how they behave, identifying who tends to emerge, and then they continue to work backwards from there. But Petrozewski, his strategy is interesting because he takes an adaptive problem first approach. And he starts by asking, what coordination problems did humans face over evolutionary time? And what kind of mental machinery would solve those problems. And so, using that lens, he argues that leadership and followership are information roles designed to do a combination of several things. The first thing that he argues that they are designed to do is solve the problem of the free rider. Now, the free rider problem is characterized as the tendency for individuals to benefit from a group's effort without contributing their own fair share along the way. And in any coalition or any team, as I'm sure a lot of you have experienced, there's always a risk that some of the members are going to reap rewards that are incommensurate with their effort while avoiding costs. This is going to corrode trust, it's going to hurt morale, and it's eventually going to hurt team performance. And so effective leaders evolved not just to set direction for the group, but to monitor their contribution, detect underperformance, and then enforce standards of fairness, either through sanctions, incentives, social signals. And without this regulatory function, the group eventually falls apart as individual members begin to feel exploited. They then scale back their effort or even enact retribution of their own against the free rider. And so leadership then is not just about motivating the group to expending effort, it's also about maintaining the delicate balance between an individual's interests, an individual's efforts, and then the collective action and the collective effort. Another evolved function of leadership, according to Petrozewski, is the ability to imagine, communicate, and then maintain coalitions, which he defines or characterizes as groups of individuals working toward a shared goal. Now, coalitions obviously don't just happen. They must first be envisioned by someone who's creative enough to see a possible advantage in a given coordinated action. That leader must then effectively communicate the idea to others in a way that resonates with their interests, resonates with their values, resonates with their needs. However, the problem is that forming a coalition is only the first step in this leadership process. A leader also has to be able to maintain that coalition over time by doing things like resolving internal conflicts, adapting to shifting incentives, and then reinforcing the group identity along the way so that everyone is expending effort towards the same orientation. So, this capacity to continuously align individuals around a common cause is one of the most fundamental and sometimes most overlooked aspects of effective leadership, because it's not just about managing tasks, it's also about the engineering of the social architecture that holds people together through changing circumstances and challenges and complexity. The other problem that Petrozewski argues that leadership evolved to solve is the problem of allocating effort across complex multi-step goals, particularly those that require a diverse set of skills, a broad range of coordination, and precision and timing during execution. And so in the most meaningful group efforts and meaningful coalitions, not everyone can and not everyone should do the same thing. Someone must understand the broader mission. They have to break it into its constituent parts. They have to assign roles based on each individual's strengths and availability and then trustworthiness, amongst others. And then Petrozewski argues that leaders evolved to serve this coordinating function, which involves identifying what has to be done, who's the best equipped to do it, and then when each task must happen. And without this strategic distribution of effort and division of labor, groups end up wasting time, they duplicate their efforts, and they often will neglect critical steps along the way. So effective leaders don't just inspire action on behalf of their followers, they organize the complexity, making sure that their followers' energy and efforts is directed and synchronized and sequenced in a way that actually achieves the goal that the group or the coalition has agreed to undertake. Now, another vital and perhaps underappreciated role of a leader is the ability for them to monitor others for competence, defection, and betrayal. And so in any coalition, obviously not all members are going to be as equally as skilled, although we would love that to be the case. They're also not going to be as equally committed. And unfortunately, they're not all going to be as equally honest. And a single weak link can end up sabotaging the entire group. And in more ancient and evolutionary times, the leaders who failed to detect that incompetence ended up losing hunts, they ended up losing battles, and they ended up losing resources. And those who missed the signs of defection or betrayal, such as hidden agendas, side deals, coalitions of resistance, they tend to pay with their status, they paid with their resources, and sometimes they even paid with their lives. And so as a result, successful leaders evolve this kind of social radar, which is an ability to track intuitively who can be trusted, who delivers under pressure, and who might be undermining the group from within. And so the idea here is that leadership isn't just about guiding action or communicating a vision. It's also about protecting the coalition by constantly assessing who's adding value and then who's quietly eroding it. This is essentially, these things combined is essentially the machinery behind the mask that is leadership. And one of the things that it means is that virtually anyone can lead, presuming that they can process the right information, presuming they can motivate the right people, and presuming they can solve the right problems. Now that we have a better understanding of leadership as a set of problem-solving functions, the next question that I would offer is, how do these roles get distributed? And the answer lies in a dynamic that you probably never heard of, and it's certainly one that I had never heard of prior to reading this article, and that is the idea of the leadership marketplace. Now, this is where offers meet evaluations and where leadership either thrives or dies. So here's where it gets interesting. Petruzzi argues that leadership and followership creates what he calls an evolutionary marketplace. Leaders propose coalitions, followers evaluate them. That's basically how it works. And the feedback loop in this marketplace acts very, very similar to natural selection. Coalitions that are incoherent, exploitative, or unmotivating end up not surviving in the long run. So one way that we could think of leadership is really a social market test with a decentralized selection process and a evolutionary based trial and error system. So from that evolutionary perspective, leadership is not just a command and control function, although it certainly can be that. It's also, and perhaps more so, a offer and evaluation function. Leader proposes we should build a well, followers decide that's worth my effort, or that's not worth my effort. And so this marketplace of ideas that happens between leader and follower is a messy thing, but as long as this healthy marketplace exists, it creates competition. And in a healthy market, leaders compete for followers, and then followers compete to be valuable members of a coalition. The good coalitions survive, the bad ones end up dying. Now, these marketplaces of ideas and these marketplaces of leader follower evaluation processes aren't fairy tales, obviously, but just because someone proposes a coalition doesn't mean that they can actually run it. And in fact, leaders are surprisingly easy to exploit by followers, particularly by followers who know how to game the system, who understand politics, and who understand how to obscure certain undesirable traits that they carry. And so let's look at the hidden vulnerabilities that's built into leadership itself. Now, we often think of leaders as people that are in control, they hold power, they give direction, they set the tone amongst a group. And while all those things are true and all those things have their place, leadership does come with its own vulnerabilities. And so, just as leaders monitor others, they themselves can be exploited by the very people that they intend to lead. And with that in mind, we can break down how followers can undermine, manipulate, or drain a leader in a coalition, and what the evolved role of leadership can and must do to guard against it. Because in less sophisticated times, if you couldn't defend your position of leadership, you wouldn't hold it for long. So the function of leadership has evolved to include these safeguards against follower exploitation. Now, having said that, leaders obviously aren't always on top. They're vulnerable. There's only one of them. There can be tens or dozens or hundreds of followers. So they can be exploited by incompetent or deceptive followers. Followers might hide their underperformance, they can exaggerate their efforts, and they can sabotage the efforts of others along the way. And so, an effective leader, a good leader, has an evolved psychology that can detect free riding that we talked about. They can respond to under contribution. They can evaluate honesty. They can evaluate motivation, and they can assess the values of their followers who are contributing to the coalition or the team. So the next time you hear a leader blame themselves, or you as a leader are blaming yourself for the shortcomings of your group, it's important to remember that part of our brains have evolved specifically to run that audit within the leadership process. Now, of course, leaders aren't the only ones at risk in the leader follower process. Followers are just as, if not more, exposed, particularly when leaders become corrupt, they become incompetent, they become self serving. And so, to understand how the leader followership system stays stable, we need to look at the other side of the power equation. So, exploitation obviously cuts both ways. Followers can be exploited by bad leaders, and they can do so in a variety of ways. One is that leaders can use followers to gain status. They can then abandon them once they've extracted their desired amount of value. And those who promise a vision but can't deliver due to negligence or competence or sometimes bad luck are exploitative of followers. And there are also leaders who siphon an incommensurate amount of value or rewards without contributing effort as a leader. And so the follower part of our brain evolved to run its own unique audit. We've learned to ask ourselves questions like, is this leader competent? Do they act in our interest? And are there better alternatives out there that would be better to follow and better to join their coalition as opposed to the one that we're a part of currently? And so this dynamic of the follower part of our brain being able to run this audit is part of what helps keep both roles accountable. And it helps drive the leadership marketplace of ideas that we talked about earlier. Now that we've talked about the risks on both sides, the real question becomes, why do so many leadership efforts fail altogether? Now, it's not necessarily because of bad people, although that can certainly be the case. It's also because of mismatched roles, unclear coordination, and broken group dynamics. And this is where the cracks in the leadership process can really begin to show. Now, statistically speaking, most leadership failures aren't moral in nature. More often than not, it's a cognitive mismatch. The leader misjudged the group's value, the follower misreads the leader's capabilities, and the coordination problem wasn't solved. This happens all the time. Someone that's a visionary, someone that's creative, can't put in the processes in place to execute. A manager who wants to do everything themselves, can't delegate, and someone who's charismatic and motivated and a good orator can't necessarily organize people and divide labor effectively. So, knowing this, effective leadership development isn't necessarily about charisma training. It isn't necessarily about how to make better pep talks. It's more important to learn how to map the information roles and the division of labor needed in the system or in the coalition. So, learning to identify who's best at imagining, who's best at communicating, who's best at keeping people on task, who's best at handling defection, whether that's one person or multiple people, the point remains the same. And so if you're leading, you're not just in charge or you're not just in command. You're responsible for solving the meta problem of how to coordinate humans at scale. And so, one practical thing to keep in mind is that a modern leader doesn't necessarily have to be the one who does all of this on their own. These things can be outsourced or delegated to those in the group who are more predisposed to the cognitive skills needed for these influence requirements. Now, personally, I'm not the most charismatic speaker. So when I had the option, I would use others who were better able to communicate my vision for the group. I'm also not the best networker. So when I found someone on my team who was able to connect with others better than I could, I would leverage that talent. And so to be successful as a modern leader, you don't necessarily have to be the one who does the imagining, who does the communicating, who divides the labor, and handles defect all on your own. So understanding these breakdowns, I think, gives us an edge. Because if leadership is a process and leadership is a role that we play rather than an identity or a trait that we inherit, then the implication is that it can be trained, it can be tested, and it can be improved with repetition. So let's take some of this theory and bring it back to the real world. So here's what all this means for you, your teams, and how you lead. The first practical takeaway that I would offer is to not hesitate to rethink who the leader is in a given context. Stop asking who has the title and start asking who's performing the information processing roles of leadership. Who's the best person to influence the group right now? The second practical takeaway that I'd offer is to train the role rather than the identity of a leader. Again, leadership isn't a birthright, it's a function, it's a process. So you can train yourself and your people to execute the roles, which involve proposing ideas, communicating plans, coordinating tasks, managing incentives along the way. All these things are involved in the leadership process and can be trained to be done better. And the third practical takeaway that I would offer is audit your coalition or team. Don't just assess your people as individuals, and don't just assess how they're performing in a given context. Assess your group design collectively, assess how the individuals on your team all work with each other, which is going to impact your capacity to execute a goal. Are the roles clear? Is your division of labor clear? Are your communication processes clear? Are your signals clear? And are your incentive structures all aligned to facilitate the goal of the coalition? This is what elite teams do. And this is how elite coaches, elite operators, and successful entrepreneurs all stay ahead of the competition. Okay, so let's end on this. It's important to remember that leadership isn't a trait, it's not status, it's a social mechanism to accomplish mutually agreed upon goals. Followership is not a weakness, it's part of the leadership process because there are no leaders without followers. The leader follower dynamic is nature's arguably most efficient way to figure out what the hell we as people should be doing next. And if we get this wrong, we end up selecting short-term signals like boldness and charisma and ignore long-term success requirements like structure and process. But if we get this right, we build coalitions and teams that can last, that can adapt, and that can end up winning and succeeding. This is the Leadership Lab. I'll see you next episode.